But today's event is an opportunity to do a deep dive in financial aid. We know that for many of our prospects and students, this is such an important consideration, especially when you're making a decision to not just spend a year at Stanford, but this is an investment of your time as well as financial resources. And we are so fortunate to have a financial aid team that is part of our team here at the GSB. And today we have Liz Lamas, who is the Director of Financial Aid for the GSB. And so we're going to do a kind of a fireside chat format. So I will have a list of some questions that we will ask Liz to address, but you will have a chance to ask your questions. So if you have specific questions you'd like to know more about, there is a Q&A box in the Zoom feature. So feel free, put your questions in Q&A. Bonnie, my colleague here, will address them as much as she can, but we will save some for Liz that she can address and answer live. So with that, I want to turn it over to Liz for a quick introduction. She can give you a little bit of background about her role and about the GSB Financial Aid team. So Liz, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Well, thanks everyone for jumping on and wanting to hear what we have to say. I am Liz, Director of Financial Aid for the GSB. So I work with our MSx team. I also work with our MBAs and our PhD students. I've been at Stanford for about 8 years. And I have been administering financial aid for 22 years. So very, very long time. I got a lot of insight that hopefully is very helpful.
Liz knows all. So maybe we can start and just, you've heard all of the main questions and concerns most students and prospects have. So let's start with probably the biggest frequently asked question. What is the costs associated with, attending the MSx program? What are the things people need to be aware of?
It's a really great question because I think a lot of students or prospective students look at the cost and it can be very overwhelming. It's almost like a sticker shock, like when you go buy a car, right? Like you just see one price, but you really don't know what goes into it, where all the costs are coming from. You also don't really know kind of where there can be savings. So the MSx program or any program at the GSB, plus usually any program that you're looking into, has the cost of attendance displayed. So for example, we have the cost of attendance on our public website, gsb.stanford.edu. You can view it now. We have a single cost and we have a married cost that's listed. The way that a school comes up with determining the cost of a program is they're taking direct costs and they're taking indirect costs to make up that total that you're seeing on the website. So direct costs are going to be things like tuition or fees that the university will charge. And indirect costs are things like a living allowance or housing, because you need those things when you're a full-time student. Just doesn't necessarily mean that university will charge you. So if you go and look at our costs on the public website, you're going to see, oh, great. Thank you, Bonnie. She just threw it in the chat for you so you can click on it. You can see it broken down by single and married. And right now, the total cost for single students are just above $200,000. And for a married, it's about $240,000. And that's for a 12-month program.
So, and when you talk about indirect costs, so some of that will vary, right, based on the individual student and how they live and all of that, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. So I can break it down even a little bit further. So when you think about direct costs and indirect costs, direct costs are mandatory charges the university is going to have to charge you. So they're going to appear on a bill. Now, if you're living on campus, that could also include housing. Indirect costs for financial aid, the reason why we publish indirect costs is because when we're awarding you aid, we need a ceiling. There has to be a maximum that you're eligible for. It can't be $1 trillion, right? It has to be reasonable. And there has to be a ceiling. So the indirect costs are essentially what you could consider like budgeted costs, right? It's just a budget, a student budget based on where you're living. What the school determines is like a a reasonable amount for those kind of expenses. So when you look at, like, for example, our cost of attendance, so tuition is a direct cost. You have to pay tuition, right? So university is going to charge you for tuition. The documentation fee that we have listed is also a direct cost. You have to pay that one-time fee. Things like the medical insurance. So to be a full-time student, you have to have medical coverage. So we have a campus health fee, which is for, resources on campus when you're a student. And we also have the medical insurance if you don't have your own medical insurance or you're leaving your employer and you need it. Those are both direct costs. Now, something like medical insurance, because you could have medical insurance anywhere, could be a cost that's one of those funny costs where it might be a direct and it also might be an indirect, meaning that could be waived from your total cost of attendance because you already have medical coverage. Why do you need double medical coverage?
Right.
But things like tuition you have to pay. When you get into the indirect costs, that's really like the living allowance and like the housing allowance. Those are budgets. That's what we anticipate you will need to be a full-time student at Stanford. Is that true to what your costs are? It just depends on your lifestyle. Now, for the MSx folks, it's interesting because you're probably working full-time right now, and your lifestyle is going to be very different than when you're a full-time student. Like,
for sure.
Yeah, like you really got to consider that, because it's going to be totally different. But what we've incorporated into that cost of attendance is a living allowance, which includes food, it includes entertainment, it includes, all those like little miscellaneous items that you need to live, every month that you don't think about. And then housing is obviously for housing costs. Like, are you living on campus? Are you living off campus? So those are costs that generally the school does not charge you directly unless you're living in on-campus housing. But it's part of that cost of attendance because we need a ceiling. We need to know how much aid you need for that 12-month program. Another piece of the cost of attendance I'll just throw in there, if we have a lot of folks on the call who maybe have children, that cost where you see online right now is a single and a married, but we also have child allowances as well. So we will, we'll build the correct cost of attendance for you specifically. If you're coming to Stanford with children. So it may look a little bit different based on your individual circumstances, but we're not going to use actuals. We're not going to come to you and say, hey, how much do you spend on food every month?
Yes.
Because
I wouldn't know that. Yeah.
I would need 30 more of me to be able to do that. But so it's a budget. I want you guys to think about a budget. This is why, they always talk about you're living on a budget, a student budget. That cost of attendance is a budget.
Yeah. And for those international students, this cost of attendance is also important when you're preparing your visa documentation. So this is important to learn and just know that this is, kind of how the Stanford model works for visas too. But maybe you can also, for those folks that might be considering an MBA or MSx, what are the cost of attendance differences between, let's say, the MSx program and the MBA program if somebody was to look at cost of attendance?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you're looking at MBA and you're looking at MSx is 4 quarters. So Stanford is a quarter school. So we do an autumn, winter, spring, and summer quarter. So most of those costs that you're going to see online are equally divisible by 4, right? Representing 1 of each quarter. There's some exceptions, but that's generally what it is. Whereas if you're looking at the MBA cost of attendance, you're looking at what we have published right now is for a single academic year. And with an MBA program, you're in school for 2 academic years. So when you're looking at MBA, you have to double the cost of an MBA to complete the program versus an MSx where you're looking at the total cost of the program online right now.
Okay, perfect.
Yep.
So if you are also looking at this as an investment, not just investment in yourself, what are some of the, what should I consider, in terms of making this determination if I should pursue an MSx degree financially?
Man. Okay. Well, so I when you start looking at graduate programs, a majority of, and especially if you went to school in the US, so, and this may be true for schools outside of the US, but I'm going to talk just real quick specifically to schools in the US. When you're an undergraduate, so you have not completed your undergraduate degree yet, there's actually a lot of sources of aid. So you have like FAFSA, which is the federal aid application. You have a lot of state aid. It's very different when you get into a graduate program. When you finally get your undergraduate degree, a lot of that assistance stops. The government and the state are willing to help you up to your undergraduate. And then once you're in a graduate program, it's kind of like on your own. This is additional. This is like a bonus. So you don't have that, excuse me, that federal or that state assistance anymore. So when you're thinking about a graduate program, especially like one at Stanford, the aid that we have available is the aid that we're willing to give as a university to our graduate students. So it's not coming from anywhere else. Now, in a graduate setting, especially in a business school setting, so if you're looking at business schools, that term that we use for like a grant or a scholarship is going to be fellowships.
Right.
That's a very common term. So when you're looking at schools or looking at Stanford, you see the word fellowship, that's essentially our grant money or fellowship aid. And so when we determine your eligibility, when you apply for aid with us, we are looking to see if you qualify for our fellowship funding. But we're also looking to see if you qualify for additional loan funding as well. Financial aid is it's a combination. A lot of people think it's just free money, but having access to educational loans is considered a form of financial aid because usually there's competitive interest rates, there's competitive terms, there are loans that you wouldn't normally have access to. So we're looking at both. We're looking at the fellowship that you may be eligible for. We're looking at loan eligibility if you need to borrow loans. For our students, anyone on the call who may be a veteran of the United States, we do our Yellow Ribbon School. So we have a lot of students who are on vocational rehabilitation, Chapter 31. We have a lot of 33 students who are post 9/11 GI Bill students with Yellow Ribbon. But then there's also some sources that you could be looking at right now that do not come from the university. So for example, we have some students who come to Stanford because their employer is willing to sponsor them. They want you to come back. So they're going to give you money.
They'll pay for you to do this program.
They're give you money and say, hey, come back to us because we want you after you've got that Stanford degree. So sponsorship is pretty common at the university as well. Is your employer contributing towards your education? There's also a big one students usually have questions on is external scholarships.
Yeah.
So there is a possibility that you could be applying for external scholarships. That's usually not through the university. Scholarships are usually what you do on your own. You try and find additional ways to mitigate costs. And then there could also be, gifts from others or loans from others. So if you can get a competitive loan from your home country and you would rather borrow with them than a traditional educational loan in the US or as an example, that's also an option, right? So there's resources that the university is going to give, mostly in the form of fellowships and loans, but then there's also resources that you should be looking for on your own. Even before you're accepted into the program. So,
yep. And I think, Liz, if I remember correctly, we do, I think on the MBA page, have a list of some resources or avenues to look if you're looking for external funding, right? I think might be some resources out there.
Yeah, there's some resources. I'll give you my favorite. There's a website that I personally like. Scholarship search engines can be very can feel a lot like spam. And it can be frustrating. The thing with scholarships is you have to be very diligent and you really have to put in a lot of time and effort to walk away with some money. But I have students who can do that and walk away with money. So the engine that I like is actually a loan provider search engine. It's called Sallie Mae. Sallie Mae is the loan provider, and they have a graduate scholarship portal where they will show scholarships that you may or may not qualify for. Getting a graduate scholarship can be difficult. I don't want to sugarcoat it. So again, it's how much effort are you willing to put into it? And are you willing to put in a lot of effort for a minimum outcome? Like you're probably not getting $50,000 scholarships, but are you okay getting 1,000, 5,000? Like all that adds up over time. So anyway, that's my oh, thank you so much. So we just threw it in the chat. So Sallie Mae is the company. But they do have a scholarship search engine as well that I like. It feels a little less like spam, but you're not limited. So a lot of students sometimes will start with their home countries. Maybe their
Yeah.
home country will have scholarships. Maybe their
There's
country or their state or their city may have scholarships. You know, there's lots of different places that you could possibly look for scholarships.
And I know like some affinity groups offer scholarships. So yeah, think broadly if you're out there looking
Yeah.
for financial resources. And also, Liz mentioned employee, you get sponsored by your employer. It doesn't
Yeah.
mean you can even negotiate for partial. It doesn't mean that they're going to underwrite the entire thing. So sometimes you might check to see if there's a education benefit at your employer. It's a pretty common thing. And so it's always worth checking. And as Liz mentioned, it can add up over time. So it's a
Yeah.
good thing if you do some due diligence. So let's talk about how aid is determined and what should people start thinking about, if they are coming into the MSx program, maybe documentation they should be updating if they're thinking about applying for aid.
Yeah. So there's generally, when you're looking at graduate programs, there's generally two schools of thought or two philosophies when you think about financial aid. One philosophy is merit. So you may be very familiar with a merit-based program. You apply for the program that you're interested in, and then based on your application to the school, you're also awarded financial aid on your competitiveness, right? Or what you're bringing to that class. That's a merit-based scholarship. It doesn't use what you are eligible for, what you can afford to determine your eligibility. It uses what's in your background to determine your eligibility. So the other school philosophy is what we call a need-based philosophy. So we look at your ability to pay for the program. And Stanford is very firmly a need-based school. We do not offer merit-based aid. Well, for lots of reasons, but for us, like everyone works really hard to get into Stanford, and we don't want to be in a situation where we're picking who's more special than somebody else, right? We know you guys are all special and you're all
Absolutely.
beautiful and you're admitted into this university. And so a need-based program really firmly aligns with our philosophy that we want this kind of underlining fairness and equity of our program. So we are only need-based. We do not offer merit. So what is need-based? Need-based is like a point in time analysis of what your income and your assets are and what your resources are that you're bringing to the table, right? So we're determining what you can afford essentially for this 12-month program. And when we talk about income and assets, we're usually looking at about a 2.5 year period of time of the income that you're earning prior to starting your program. So that's what we're considering. We're also, because it's a need-based program, we're very aware that what you earn in a year doesn't always necessarily mean that's how much income you have access to. So for example, we absolutely understand that there are mitigating circumstances, like you are supporting multiple people, like maybe you're supporting your family. You maybe look like you earn a lot on paper, but you're also supporting way more than what you can document or claim on your taxes. Like those are the kind of situations that we're looking for. So we will give you tons of opportunity to, yes, report to us what you earn, what your assets are, but also explain to us like what's outgoing, like what are your obligations, your financial obligations, and how does that play into your overall picture of what you can afford.
Right. So if somebody's out there thinking, okay, I want to be on this, I gotta, get my financial documentation together. At Stanford, when does the financial aid process start? And what should people be aware of in terms of the process here at the GSB?
That's a great question. So the process for applying for aid actually does not start until after you are admitted into the program. So you have to be admitted first. We are not going to review your eligibility prior to being admitted. It's a rigorous application and process, and we want you to focus on that, get into the university, and then we will work with you to make sure that is something that you can afford. So you will not begin applying until after you're admitted. Once you're admitted, we're going to give you some time to apply for our aid program. We will then review that as a team for the financial aid office and issue an award letter to you prior to you accepting your admissions offer. It's really important to us that you understand what the financial obligation is, what kind of aid you may or may not be eligible for prior to actually accepting your offer to the GSB. So you will have time to review it, to ask us questions, to formulate a plan, so you feel really good about committing to Stanford and coming to school. So that's usually the process.
Yeah. And, but that also, maybe you can say, like, people can still apply if they miss the first round of deadlines and then they realize later on that they might need aid, they can still work
Oh
with your
yeah,
team.
we're so flexible. I mean, that we do have some hard deadlines, like at some point we have to stop awarding people. Right? But like, we if this, you're admitted and it falls into a really bad time for you to apply for aid just because of things you have going on in your personal life, we're not, there will be plenty of opportunity for you to apply. I think the most important thing is if it's a major deciding factor for you and you need to know that information to accept your
Right.
admissions offer, you'll definitely want to pay attention to the deadlines. But
Yes.
if it, it's a factor, but you're coming to the GSB no matter what, yeah, absolutely. You have more time to play with. But we just want to make sure you have enough information to make an informed decision at the end of the day.
Yes, absolutely. So, we're very fortunate at the GSB to have our fellowship money, and we have relationship with lenders. But what other resources can people turn to, for financial aid outside of the GSB? Are there federal and private options that people can look into for funding?
Yeah, so the GSB, it generally is not a lender when we talk about funding. So fellowship wise, our main source of funding is going to be the need-based aid. Now, once you're here, depending on what you want to do, there could be other fellowship resources at the university. So for example, if you're thinking about totally pivoting and going into like a social impact career, we have an incredible social impact center. It's called the Center for Social Innovation, that is independent of my office and is more career focused. Like, what do you want to do when you leave the GSB? And they even have their own fellowship resources as well, right? But they're not based on coming into the program, they're based on exiting the program. So there's going to be other opportunities at the university outside of my office, but you're not going to know what those opportunities are, or if you're going to if you're going to utilize them until you're closer to being in the program and figuring out what you want to do with your life.
Exactly.
People do come and they pivot. So outside of that, then loan options specifically, we talked about scholarships and external resources, but loan options specifically, we're very fortunate to offer some loan options for not just our US citizens, but also our international students. So we have specifically curated a couple loan options for our international students that don't require a US based cosigner. So you receive it based on your own application. You don't need a cosigner or endorser. And so we are fairly confident that we have enough resources for our students to finance their education. For my US citizens, you kind of have a lot of options on the table. So not only do you have access to private loans, but you may have access to federal student loans, certain federal student loans. So there's a lot of talk at the when you meet with us, a lot of students want to focus on I know I need to borrow, like that's just what it is. I have to borrow loans. What's my strategy behind borrowing loans? Like, what do I have access to? What's the timing in which you need to borrow? Can I leverage that timing to mitigate interest accumulation? Like, we talk a lot about the strategy behind it, but you will have multiple options, not only US citizens, but international students on the table that you can choose from. So it's a pretty robust loan program as well.
That's great. So, we do have a fair amount of international students in MSx. Are there other kind of considerations international students should be aware of when they're looking for financial aid?
I alluded to it, but I think just to kind of hone it in one more time is exploring the resource. If you're an international student, exploring the resources from your home country prior to coming to the GSB is super important. I think a lot of students, especially if you're planning to return to your home country, feel much more comfortable taking out a loan in their own currency, like the currency that you're repaying the loan in, versus taking a US currency loan and repaying it in a US currency. So I think, exploring loans and not just loans, but also scholarship options from your home country is number one, should be your number one priority. Like, what resources does this country have for me to study abroad? And then if there's none, that's okay. The GSB has those resources we talked about. But I think if you're really trying to mitigate expenses, if you're really trying to drive down what you're obligated to at the end of the day, then exploring those options up front in your own home country is going to be really, really important. And
Yeah.
that's also, I mean, I know that's very internationally specific, but for US citizens, you can also apply that in the US, right? Like what, your state, your community, your, employer, those are all the same resources that you may have access to as well. You have to have those conversations, and you have to put in that work to figure out what do I have access to.
Yeah, and you also mentioned earlier about like strategies. Are there any challenges or issues about if people want to pay off their loans early or have, look at loan funding in a different way?
Yeah, so that's part of the strategy. When we think about loan strategy, the way I frame it for students when we're having conversations is this a short-term solution or is this a long-term solution?
Right.
Are you taking a loan for the entire term of the loan? Let's say your loan is 10 years. Is your plan to have it for 10 years, or is your plan to have it for 5 years? And then ideally at that point, depending on what you want to do when you left school, you're going to pay it off with like a bonus or, whatever
Right.
you need to do. There are usually, when you take a traditional educational loan, and I'm speaking now from a US perspective and loans that we offer to students studying in the US that I'm aware of, your home country loans that I just told you to apply for, I don't know. But the US based loans usually are no prepayment penalties. So you're paying it off a whole lot faster and saving
Yeah.
a ton of money on interest if you're thinking about it as a short-term solution versus a long-term solution.
Right.
And and another piece of this, if we can pull that back up to what I talked about in the cost of attendance, if you're looking at the cost of attendance and you find areas to save in, like we talked about the medical insurance, we talked about living expenses, the housing, those are just budgets, right? If your true budget is not that, you can drive down that borrowing as well. So that's why that budget is so important, because I want you to figure out what the costs are for you. And so that will help mitigate the debt. But also, if you're thinking about this as a short-term solution, over time, you're going to save a lot of money on interest accumulation because there's no prepayment penalties.
Yeah.
There's lots of different ways to look at it, but
Sure.
strategy is a big one.
Yeah, and flexibility sounds like it can
Flexibility.
really be beneficial, for financial planning. So, like,
Yes.
if people are out there thinking about this, what
Yeah.
do you recommend they start thinking about for planning ahead?
So you never want, so the biggest thing I would say is scholarships in general. So first of all, I want you to make sure you totally understand the financial commitment that you're making, right? This is a financial commitment. This isn't, you're going to get admitted and you're going to get a free ride to Stanford. I wish I had that much money. I wish I was the case. I was just admitting and giving everyone free rides. That's not the way it works. In a need-based system, we determine your eligibility. So we determine if you qualify for aid, and sometimes that means you don't qualify for aid, right? So it just depends on your financial situation. So if I want you to consider, like, is this the overall financial commitment and what I am and am not willing to take on or to pay for this educational program. It's really, really important to understand that and make sure you're coming in fully aware, and you're not just expecting $100,000 scholarship from the university. Because I'll be totally honest, it's very rare and it does not happen very often. I also want you to think about the timing in which you need to borrow. So like we just talked about, the strategy on short-term, long-term solutions, but the strategy on the timing in which you need to borrow. So your program is for 12 months. Are you borrowing in month 1 or are you borrowing in month 8? because you just save 7 months of interest accumulation if you delay it, right? So
Mhm.
there's strategy behind the timing as well. External scholarships, a lot of external scholarships. This is where students fail often with external scholarships. They assume they one either can't or they don't apply for scholarships prior to being admitted and or to the program. That's false. Definitely do not wait. If you're like, I need scholarships, there's no way I can pay $200,000. And if the GSB is not going to give me a full ride, I'm not, then you need to start applying for scholarships immediately because most scholarship opportunities award students a year in advance, a year in
Mm,
advance. There's some scholarships that are open right now for fall of 2026, and they will might close in December. And
right.
if you're waiting to get into the program and delay, like, and deciding then, oh, maybe I should apply for scholarships, you're not going to get any. You have to plan in advance. Even if you don't know where you're going to go to school, most scholarship organizations will one, let you change schools. So they'll let you
Mhm.
change the scholarship of the school. Or they'll delay it for you to make sure that you can have access to it. Like they already want you. They're just, you just don't have it anywhere to send it to yet. And then like I mentioned before, budgeting is super important. Like for MSx specifically, you're in school, you take 12 months out of your life to do this. But for that 12 months, you are not employed. You cannot be employed. This is a very rigorous program. We don't allow students to work during this program. There's no way that would happen. You are now a student on a student budget, and you really gotta change that mindset. You don't have that full-time income anymore. How are you going to make this work on a budget? And that's super, super important. What can you cut back on? You're going to feel a lot better leaving the school if you've made those sacrifices up front for 12 months. That's it, 12 months, 1 year of
Right.
your professional life working, which is not very long when you think about your total career. You're going to feel a lot better if you've mitigated, if you saved in those areas and you're not walking away with tons and tons of debt.
Right.
Yeah.
So thinking about this class, first of all, I should mention to the audience, we are need blind. And when we look at admissions,
Yeah.
we don't factor your ability to pay as part of our admission consideration. And we have a firewall, meaning, when Liz and her team do financial aid computations, we are not part of that discussion. It's completely based on the need that you present. But with that, so we don't have quite the same level of knowledge you do about the class. So in the most recent class, what kind of percentage of the students did qualify for aid, and what was the average aid amount? And when we talk about aid, I think Liz was very clear, we call fellowship. So maybe you can tell people kind of for this most recent intake, what that looked like.
Yeah, so the average award for the MSx program is around $50,000 for the program. That's fellowship funding that comes off the total cost of the program. The number of students that qualify for aid in the MSx program is around 30%. Now, that doesn't mean that's how many apply for aid. That's just how many qualify for aid.
Right. And we should mention too, aid is usually distributed, right, over, like we do billing based on the quarter, correct?
Yeah, like I mentioned, Stanford's 4 quarters. So a lot of the costs that you're going to see online is they're equally divisible by 4. And then the aid, including loans, will also be equally divisible by 4. So it will spread out. It's not like you have to pay for everything up front. It will be spread out over that 12-month period.
Right. So it's usually at the start of each quarter. So for budgeting purposes, you can kind of plan ahead.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
So with that, let's turn it over, Bonnie. I don't know if we have some questions that came in Q&A, or I see some things that hit in the chat.
You just answered a couple of the questions about the average amount of aid, so meaning fellowships, which you said was about 50,000 for the MSx program. So that was answered. And also just clarifying that when we talk about fellowships, need-based aids, it's also applicable to international students, including loans, which you've also answered. That came up in the question as well. There is one here that says, I have a home mortgage that I continue to need to pay. during this program. So how do you think about that in terms of, potentially renting out, or do people borrow more in order to keep paying that mortgage? Any advice on something like that?
Yeah, so legally in the United States, we can't, so a mortgage is considered consumer debt, right? It's a
Mhm.
choice to take on that debt. We do not consider, for aid eligibility, we do not consider the cost of that mortgage while you're a full-time student. So it's a great question, because you really have to make sure that you can continue meeting that financial obligation. Now, if you're renting out to cover that mortgage, that's totally fine. It doesn't penalize you in any way as in part of our program. Oh, my bad. Okay. So yeah, so that's it's still something you're going to report to us, so we understand the nature of what's happening. We're also looking at, when we think about assets, we do consider liquid and illiquid assets in our process, right? We're trying to identify your total financial strength. Like, what is your total financial strength when you're applying for aid? And so reporting the mortgage that you have against that asset is also something we're going to ask for. What is that? What debt are you carrying against that asset as well?
Great. Thank you for that. There's also a question, I imagine it's from someone who's thinking of applying jointly to the MSx and MBA program. You mentioned about the fellowships for MSx program. Is it the same type of thinking and lens and process and approach for the MBA program, or any differences between how aid is done between the two programs?
No, so the only difference is the cost of attendance, right? Because we're looking at a 12-month program versus a 2-year program with MBA. So with the MSx program, you usually have one award for that 12-month program, and it's split over those quarters. Where with the MBA program, you apply each academic year. Now we determine your eligibility up front for the program, and we're having you renew your application. But so every year, so when you first enroll into MBA, the costs and that cost of attendance that are associated may change in the next year. The tuition will stay flat. You're locked in under that tuition rate when you start the MBA program. But those other costs, if there's inflation that we need to consider, if the cost of housing is rising, those costs could increase in the second year. But when it comes to philosophy, every student that we're awarding need-based aid to is treated the same. So it's one algorithm for all students to determine your eligibility.
Right.
And just to follow on that, someone asked about, does it matter if I'm applying in a later round? Basically, there's no risk of running out when you're a need-based system versus merit,
exactly.
Merit, yeah.
When you're need, our commitment to the community, the Stanford community, is that anyone who has need, we are going to meet that need, right? So if you're applying in round 1 versus round 3 or whatever, there is no difference. There is no difference.
Right. We have had a couple questions. So we've talked about on the Sallie Mae, for example, access to graduate loans, but then about a lot of talk on scholarships for international students. Do we have any links or advice to any aggregated websites out there? Or is it very dependent on, individual situations?
So Sallie Mae will allow you to I think isolate down what scholarships may be eligible for non-citizens, non-US citizens. So that's an option. It's difficult. Like I mentioned, it's really hard. We don't have a single list that we can provide, because generally the scholarships that students are eligible for here are unique to their circumstances. That's why they were awarded, right? And so it just depends. There's tons of scholarship search engines that are out there. So again, I like Sallie Mae, but you don't have to use Sallie Mae. So even if you're doing your own research just for international scholarships for students studying in the US, you could do that research and find another great search engine that works for you. But we don't have a cumulative list of all the international scholarships in the in the world to share with you, unfortunately, because it's ever growing, ever changing.
Right. All right. I see we have about 5 minutes left. So there's a couple more questions here. So one is regarding healthcare. So what are some healthcare options for perhaps my spouse who will have to quit their job at Palo Alto? I assume that healthcare costs you could do not just for yourself, but for family as well, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So with Stanford Healthcare, or Cardinal Care is what it's called, they do have an option for spouses, and they also have an option for dependents as well.
Yeah.
Okay. And a question about, do applicants or students with families and children have a higher chance of receiving a fellowship or financial aid in the MSx program?
Totally depends.
Yeah.
Totally depends on your financial situation. This is the beauty of a need-based program. There's no income threshold that I can give you. There's no, there's no scale that I can provide to you. It's based on the individual circumstances, and everybody is a little bit different. Someone who's making $100,000 a year as a single person may or may not qualify for aid, whereas someone who's making $100,000 a year with 6 kids may. Or they may not. Like it just totally depends. So yeah, it doesn't. There's no guarantee that anyone receives aid, but we will do our best to understand your situation, and you'll be fairly treated as everybody else.
Great. And then there's a question you mentioned earlier about aid for military veterans, but that was more specific to the U.S. How about someone that's from military that's not U.S.? Are there any benefits or extra resources for non-U.S. military?
No, so the resources that we talk about when we talk about military resources for U.S., they're coming from our Department of Veterans Affairs, in partnership with the GSB. That's what the Yellow Ribbon Program is, but primarily they're being funded by the Veterans Affairs Department. So there is nothing in the U.S. specifically for you if you're a veteran from another country, but your country may have something, right? So this is again pointing, if you're comparing yourself to a U.S. citizen. Our U.S. citizens have a whole department from our government that supports them. Does yours? All right. So that would be going back to your home country to see if they have any resources for you.
Great. Yeah, good advice. And how about fee waivers? Do we offer any fee waivers?
That's a great question. I'm actually going to pass it to you guys. Do you guys offer fee waivers?
Only for U.S. military. Sorry.
The fee waivers.
Yes.
Great.
So Liz, go ahead, Bonnie.
I thought I had one more question here, but I think we've pretty much have covered everything.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so for documentation, right, you're going to ask people, so people are looking at things to bring, I guess, tax returns, pay stubs, list of assets, anything else people need to start thinking about for getting their financial affairs in order?
No, I think we're going to ask for income. We're going to ask for asset information. We're going to ask for resources. So you definitely should start thinking about resources that you're going to bring with you. If I haven't drilled it into you already, start it now. And then also, like, what are your extenuating circumstances that we need to know about? Because we're going to ask you to document those.
Yeah.
So
it's good advice to start thinking about that now. So if you're admitted this way, you can hit the ground running to apply for aid right away.
Absolutely.
Oh, yes.
And there was a question here.
Exactly. One last one. Thank you, Ryan, for reminding me. There's one last question about, does the Stanford MSx program qualify as a STEM program? And that answer is yes. Both our MSx program and MBA program are considered STEM programs. And a real benefit for international students is if you are considering staying and working in the U.S. after graduation, you can apply for OPT eligibility to stay in the U.S. for potentially up to 3 years after graduation.
Cool.
Well, I think we got through all the questions.
Yes, we did.
And we're right on time. I wanted to thank Liz so much for joining today and giving us an overview about the GSB financial aid philosophy and some strategies. So hopefully it will make things a little easier for the people on the call to think about, as they're preparing for this adventure, which we call MSx. Wanted to thank all of you guys so much for joining today and asking wonderful questions. We will be posting this event on one of our channels shortly. So if you need to go back and review it, it will be available for you. Thank you again. And Bonnie, thank you so much for managing the inbox. And thanks again, Liz, for everybody, for your help. Have a good rest of your day, everybody. Take care. Thank you so much.